Today I want to talk about spiritual warfare. Fun topic, right? Because the first reading especially focuses on that theme of spiritual warfare. And when I say those words, we kind of think about the battle between good and evil. The battle between good and evil, which we may think of in a grand sense. We can look at the scriptures. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, we hear about war breaking out in heaven between Michael, the head of the archangels, and his cadre of angels against the dragon and his army of angels. And the dragon is none other than Satan and the devil and the demons. And we hear, thanks be to God, that Michael is victorious. Michael and the good angels, the good, defeat the evil. So we kind of think about that, and from that we hear that the Satan and the devil are cast down to earth. And we also hear that he's described as a deceiver of all. So maybe we think about spiritual warfare in that grand sense, but we can also think about it in a mundane sense as well. That spiritual warfare isn't just in the heavens, but it's something that you and I may experience each and every day, maybe even today, probably today. Spiritual warfare is that fight against good and evil that we face today. And we can even go to maybe St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And he says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the forces of evil. It's important to be reminded that our true fight is not each other, but it is against the forces of evil. And in fact, looking at the name Satan is cast out of heaven. He's thrown out of heaven because of that war in heaven. And he's sent down to the earth. So we know he's prowling around here. St. Peter says that he's prowling like a roaring lion. But the name Satan actually gives us a little insight into his nature. Satan means one to divide or one to drive apart. And that's exactly what he wants to do with us. Satan wants to drive us apart, both, as people. He rejoices when he drives apart families, when he drives apart communities, when churches even, or parishes, they get driven apart, or maybe even just any type of people. But also, too, what Satan wants to do is he wants to drive us apart from God. He wants us to be separated. That's what he's ultimately trying to triumph over. So we need to recognize that at any moment he's trying to deceive us. He's trying to turn us against, he may try to turn us against one another, but we need to always know that we need to seek out God. We need to, as St. Paul also says in Ephesians, put on the armor of God against these attacks. I have a friend who's a priest, and he's an exorcist. Well, no, he's not an exorcist, but he works in deliverance ministry, but he works with exorcists. So I get to meet up with him maybe once or twice a year, and you can imagine I have a lot of great questions for him as an exorcist. I'm like, did they really run up the wall like an exorcist? You kind of see that stuff? Not all my questions are about that. Most of them are, but not all. But he's in a very, very interesting and a very, very important ministry, because there's a lot of people that come to him with great afflictions. That they maybe not possessed. That's at very extreme, but sometimes they're maybe under demonic oppression, which means that there is some kind of evil influence that they'd be able to decipher, that they're in need of curing. And he only works about 3 hours a week because the work is so exhausting. It's just so exhausting to have to deal with these kind of influences. But he tells me a lot. I bring a lot of things to him because I'm like, and sometimes I'm kind of on the front line of this, being a priest. But he also said this: often people will come to him and say, well, what should I do? I feel I'm under attack. Should I have my house blessed? Should I just have holy water at all times? Should I get St. Benedict medals, and should I have them blessed? Should I have exorcised salt? Should I get all these things? And he tells those people, he says, that's a secondary remedy. That's something you want to go to secondarily. What will give you the best, the most primary solution, the most primary defense against the devil is prayer. Prayer will strengthen you against the assault of any evil. Not only that, he says, I give people a regimen. Prayer, and also, if they're Catholic, go to the sacraments. Go to the Mass. If we're at Mass every week, we're in a very good place. That will help us put up our defense against the devil. But not only to that, the sacrament of confession is also another remedy. If we make regular use of the sacrament of confession, he says, that's also going to strengthen us. So when St. Paul talks about putting on the armor of God in chapter 6 of Ephesians, he's talking about prayer. Not physical armor, but taking on that armor of prayer. If we're people of prayer, if we pray every day, we're going to be strengthened. We're going to be strengthened against any assault that may try to take us down. And that's true. Even if you'll read more into chapter 6, St. Paul uses some great imagery to talk about the armor of God. He also says that we should put on the helmet of salvation and take up the sword of the Spirit. If we immerse ourselves in prayer, we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. We're going to be close to God, and it's going to help us no matter where we go. Relying on prayer. That's the heart of today's readings, is that we need to rely on prayer, whatever we do. Let's go to this first reading from the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus talks about Moses. And so Moses, again, is where we hear about him having another moment where he's able to intercede for God's people. Kind of set the stage is that the people of Israel in Exodus, they have escaped from slavery, and now they're wandering the desert for 40 years. And of course, they're coming across some people that don't want them, that kind of find them as a threat. Today being the Amalekites. And the Amalekites, on paper, are much stronger than the nation of Israel. They would wipe them out in a battle. So that's why what Moses is doing is so important, because Moses, as you hear, he lifts his hands. And if his hands are raised, Israel has the better in the fight. Now, when's another time you see somebody with their hands raised? Well, about 15 or 20 minutes, that's what I'm going to be doing. What this is called, when the priest is at the altar, that's called the orans position, and that's a position of intercession. So as a priest, I'm interceding for the people, whatever mass I'm saying. And that's exactly what Moses is doing in the first reading. He is interceding for his people in prayer. Prayer is what's helping Israel win the battle. When his arms are raised, they have the better in the fight. But then we notice that as we do when we have our arms raised, that Moses is starting to get a little bit tired. And then that's when Israel starts to get the less in the battle. But then there's an important thing here. There's an important lesson too, because Moses relies on the strength of those around him. He relies on Aaron and Hur to help his arms up. That's a great lesson for us, to tell us the importance of asking for one another's prayer, help in prayer. If we feel we're weary, if we feel we're kind of lax in prayer, which happens, that's human nature, if we feel we're growing lax in prayer, that's why it's good for us to ask each other to pray for our intentions, because that will help us strengthen ourselves in the battle. And ultimately, who wins? Israel. Israel, because prayer wins out. Moses is able to maintain that intercession and win the battle. So we kind of, to sum that up, kind of talking about prayer. Prayer is our opportunity to cooperate with God's will for us. Prayer is our opportunity for God to cooperate with God's will for us. Sometimes we may kind of think, well, is life just scripted? Is everything just kind of predetermined to happen? There's some people that believe that. They probably believe that there's nothing that we can do to influence God. But as Catholic Christians, we don't believe that. We believe that we can cooperate with God's will, and that will help, and we can have a say in what happens. So that's the great thing about God's mysterious will for us, is that He, in His goodness, allows us to cooperate with Him. So maybe we're facing something. Maybe we're facing a lot of different things in our life. Why don't we just pray over everything that we face? Sometimes we may think that, well, maybe God doesn't. Well, why do I want to bring this to God? It seems like it's something so small. Or we may say, well, I don't think God wants to help me with this situation. Well, I'll give you this suggestion. What if we prayed over everything? What if we prayed over our problems? What if we prayed over our dilemmas? Maybe that would help us get a better understanding, or maybe God will lead us to a solution. That's another thing we may do from time to time, is that we may pray for a certain outcome. That we may pray, God, please let this happen. I do that all the time. My success rate is probably not that great. If we were talking baseball, I'm probably batting below the Mendoza line. That's 200. Throw my baseball reference for my peoples out there. But so sometimes we kind of are thinking like we want to pray for a certain outcome. What if we prayed not for a certain outcome, but maybe for God to broaden our perspective? What if we ask God to maybe help us see what's not there? God, help me to see this, see this situation maybe more broadly. Or maybe even to say, God, help me to change my heart or change my mind. Sometimes God is doing that. Sometimes He's inviting us to that. And sometimes that may be an incredible thing that may help us to understand His will even more. When I was in seminary about 9 years ago, I was invited to a wedding. I was invited to a wedding of my friend from college. And I was down in Baltimore at the time. I was studying in my second year of seminary. And she and her now husband were married in New York City. And so I was so happy. I was so happy to get invited. And I kind of looked at everything. I was planning to go. And then I realized, well, New York City, I've got to have to get a hotel and drive there and stay overnight. And as a seminarian, I have a salary of probably zero. So I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this work because I may have to spend maybe $1,000 on 2 nights in a hotel. So I was kind of distraught because my friend wanted me to be there, and my other friends from college were also going to be there. So I'm kind of like thinking to myself, oh man, Lord, I'd love to go. I'd love to go to this wedding. I'm like, can you send somebody with $1,000 to help me to get there? You think that happened? Yeah, no, dude. But I remember this. I was sitting in a prayer, and it's not. It wasn't one of the. It probably wasn't the most serious thing to bring to prayer. But I brought it to God, and I was praying one day, and I realized, well, there's more than one way to get to New York City. I don't have to drive in there and stay in a hotel. Actually, there are trains that run from Baltimore to New York City, believe it or not. So I had that epiphany in the chapel, and I realized, well, I can leave early on Saturday and go to the wedding, and then I can come back late on Saturday, and I can be back in Baltimore in a whole day. So that's exactly what I did. I left Penn Station in Baltimore at 5:30 in the morning, got into New York Penn Station at 8 a.m., had breakfast with a few friends, then we went to the wedding, which was at Old St. Patrick's Basilica in downtown Manhattan. So if you've ever seen The Godfather, Part 3, there's a scene in there, I think, with a baptism. Well, it makes sense if it was a baptism, right? Because it's in a church. So, I got to go to that, got to go to the wedding, go to a reception up in Midtown Manhattan overlooking the Empire State Building, and then I was able to be on the train at New York Penn Station at 10:30 and be back in Baltimore by 1 a.m. So the thing is that I learned from that is that, sometimes God just is trying to kind of make us see another way. Sometimes He's not going to give us exactly what we ask for, but He'll give us what we need. That's the whole point that I realized from that, is that something like God's imagination is so much greater than ours, is that all we have to do is just ask Him to help us share that great imagination that He has. And so today we kind of look at prayer as also something that we armor ourselves with, but it's something that we also must be persistent in. That's what Jesus is teaching us in the gospel today. He's teaching us to be persistent in prayer. Just like this widow. The parable of the poor widow is what we hear today, and Jesus says we should be like that widow here, that persistent widow. She goes to this judge day in and day out, and she continues to go to him. And even the judge says, well, this lady's bothering me. I'm just going to allow her to have whatever she wants. And Jesus says that's a lot like our prayer life with God. Sometimes we go to Him and go to Him. We shouldn't never stop going to Him. So maybe the moral of the story of this gospel is keep on bothering God. Keep on bothering God with whatever you got, because God is listening. God is listening to our prayers. And the great thing about it is that we may see exactly what we want, but even if we don't, He's going to lead us to some place where His will leads us to. And maybe that will be an even better place than we've thought of. So today, we go and remember that prayer is that armor of God. If we continue to go to prayer day in and day out, that will be something that strengthens us against all evil, anything that can threaten to take us away from God. And it's important for us to keep being persistent in that prayer. Keep on bothering God day in and day out. Because maybe we will see our prayers answered. But even if we don't see our prayers answered exactly the way we would like them, if we continue to persist in prayer, we will more and more get to know God's will, get to know God's peace, get to know God's love for us, and the plan that He has for each of us.